What nobody tells you about Somebody to Love is that it isn't a celebration. You know the sound of it, that huge gospel choir, that joyful wall of voices, a song people sing at weddings and in football stadiums with their arms around strangers. But listen to what the man is actually asking. He is standing in the middle of the biggest sound he ever built, begging someone, anyone, to find him love. In 1976, Freddie Mercury was at the very top of the world. Queen had just conquered the charts, he had money, fame, and 100,000 people screaming his name. And he sat down and wrote the loneliest song of his life. To understand it, you have to understand where he was standing. Bohemian Rhapsody had spent 9 weeks at #1. The band that had been nearly broke a year earlier was now one of the biggest acts on earth. Freddie had the flat in Kensington, the money, the clothes, the parties that started at midnight and ended when the sun came up. By every measure the world uses, he had won. And here's the thing about winning like that. It doesn't fill the room. Friends from that period describe a man who was electric in a crowd and strangely quiet when the crowd left, who kept people around him late into the night, not because the party was good, but because he didn't want to be alone in the house.
Now, where did that enormous gospel sound come from? Freddie was obsessed with a voice from across the Atlantic, Aretha Franklin. He'd been listening to gospel and soul for years, to the way a black American church choir could take a single line and lift it until it filled the whole building. He loved the architecture of it, the way one voice calls out and 100 voices answer. So he decided he wanted that, not a pastiche of it, the real weight of it, on a Queen record. But there's something strange about that decision, and almost nobody stops to notice it, because that gospel sound comes out of the Christian church. And Freddie Mercury was not a Christian. He was born Farrokh Bulsara on the island of Zanzibar in 1946. His family were Parsis, followers of Zoroastrianism, one of the oldest religions on earth. Not a church with pews and a choir, a faith built around a sacred flame, around a very old idea that a person's life is a contest between good thoughts and everything else. So when he sat down to write Somebody to Love, he reached for the sound of a religion that was not his own and used it to ask a question that was. He wasn't singing a hymn, he was arguing. The song calls out to a God, and it doesn't praise him, it asks him a question close to an accusation. Why give a man everything and leave him with no one? A man raised beside a sacred flame, borrowing a church choir to demand an answer from someone else's God. That's what you're actually hearing.
And then he had to build it. Here's the problem. A real gospel choir means 100 people in a room. Queen didn't hire 100 people. They used 3, Freddie and 2 of his bandmates. 3 voices, recorded over and over, layered on top of each other again and again, until the tape held something that sounded like a congregation. If that technique sounds familiar, it should. It's the same obsession that had nearly worn the tape transparent on Bohemian Rhapsody a year earlier. Only this time, he wasn't building a mock opera. He was building a church. The sessions were relentless. Take after take, the same phrases sung again and again, each stacked onto the last, then played back to see whether the wall of sound had grown tall enough yet. Then again. Queen produced this one themselves, and you can hear the control in it. The choir answers exactly on the beat, every time, the way a real congregation answers a preacher. Imagine what that looked like from the outside. A man alone in a vocal booth, singing the answering part to his own question, over and over, for days. He was manufacturing the sound of company.
And that's the detail that turns this whole song inside out. Listen to the record again with this in your head. The man asks whether anyone can find him somebody to love, and a huge, warm, comforting choir answers him. It sounds like the world responding, like the loneliness has been heard. But that choir is him. Every one of those 100 voices is Freddie Mercury, or the two friends standing closest to him, recorded over and over into an illusion of a crowd. So the song isn't a man crying out and being answered. It's a man crying out and answering himself, and hoping it sounds like enough. The loneliest thing on that record isn't the question. It's the choir.
So why was he asking? On paper, it makes no sense. This was a man surrounded by people, adored on stage by tens of thousands, a man who could walk into any room in London in 1976 and own it inside a minute. But there's a kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with how many people are in the room. It comes from the parts of yourself you can't put on the table. Freddie had built the most public voice in Britain, and there was something enormous about who he was that he could not say out loud. You have to remember what 1976 actually was. Being openly gay or bisexual in Britain then wasn't a headline, it was a hazard. It had only been partly decriminalized 9 years earlier, and the culture had not caught up with the law. For a rock singer whose face was on the front of magazines, saying it plainly would not have been brave, it would have been a demolition. So he didn't say it plainly, he said it the only way he safely could. He put it in a song, wrapped it in a gospel choir, made it enormous and joyful and universal, and let the whole country sing it back to him without ever knowing what they were singing. Everyone heard a party anthem. He'd hidden a confession inside it, in plain sight, and nobody noticed for years.
And here's where the timing stops being a coincidence. Around this same period, Freddie finally told Mary Austin the truth. Mary was the person he'd been with for years, the one he'd built a life around, the one who knew him before Queen was Queen. By most accounts, she was the closest thing to home he ever had. And in that stretch of the mid-70s, he sat down with her and told her about himself. It ended the romance, it did not end the love. She stayed the most important person in his life until the day he died, and he left her his home. But something did close that day, and both of them knew it. Now put that beside the song. A man who had just lost the one relationship that made him feel less alone, sitting down to write a track asking whether anybody, anywhere, could find him somebody to love. That's not a pop lyric. That's a man reporting the weather inside his own house.
The record came out in November of 1976, and it went almost straight up. Number 2 in Britain, a hit in America. It landed on the album A Day at the Races and became exactly what a great Queen single was supposed to become. Enormous. Everywhere. And the world heard it as a celebration. Of course it did. It's got that lift, that great swelling joy in the back half, where the voices pile up and the whole thing takes off. People dance to it. Nobody stopped and thought, wait, what is this man actually asking us? He told the entire world exactly how alone he felt, at maximum volume, with a 100-voice choir behind him, and the entire world sang along and missed it completely. But something happened when he took it on stage, because live, he didn't have 100 layers of tape. He had one voice and one microphone. So he'd sing the question out into the dark, and then he'd stop, and tens of thousands of people would sing the answer back to him. In the studio, he had faked the choir with his own voice because there was nobody there. On stage, the choir was real. Every night, a stadium full of strangers stood in the dark, thousands of little lighter flames burning above their heads, and answered a question he'd been too frightened to ask anyone directly. And then he was gone. Freddie died in November of 1991. A few months later, the surviving members of Queen filled a stadium in London for a concert in his memory.
and one by one, singers came out to take his songs. When they got to Somebody to Love, George Michael sang it. And people who were there still talk about it because something strange happened in that stadium. It stopped being a tribute and became the thing itself. 70,000 people singing the choir part of a song that a lonely man had once built out of his own multiplied voice because he had nobody in the room. The illusion had finally become true, and he wasn't there to hear it. That's the cruelty and the beauty of that song, sitting in the same 3 minutes.
So why is this the one that still gets people 50 years on? Not the biggest song, not the most technically astonishing, but the one that reliably takes the legs out from under people who thought they were just having a nice time at a wedding. Here's what I think. Freddie never told you it was a sad song. He never let the music sag, never let the arrangement feel sorry for itself. He took the loneliest question a person can ask and dressed it in the biggest, warmest, most joyful sound he could build, and he sang it like a man who refused to be pitied. That's not hiding. That's defiance. So the next time that choir comes crashing in and the room lifts and everybody puts their arms around each other, remember what it's made of. 3 men in a studio, stacking their voices into the shape of a congregation. A man borrowing someone else's church to ask a question he couldn't ask out loud. A man who had just told the person he loved most the truth about himself and lost something he never got back. He built 100 voices because he didn't have one, and then he stood in front of the world and made the world sing it back to him. If you'd like to hear the real stories behind the songs you thought you already knew, stay with us. The next time you listen to who's answering him.